All right, and welcome to the Wagner College Holocaust Center's annual summer conference. I am Marjorie Steinberg, a member of the conference committee and the advisory board of the Holocaust Center. This year, our conference is dedicated to legal issues in the Holocaust and genocide. We have several talks and panels, opening with our keynote speaker, as well as leading legal and genocide scholars and experts, and practicing attorneys. Following the panels, we will hear commentary by Ms. Jacqueline Murakate and Mr. Leo Almond. As you may know, our second panel is offering continuing legal education credit. Our program will conclude with reflections by two members of our conference committee. We hope that all of you will join us afterwards for a cocktail hour and continuing conversation. Thank you on behalf of Wagner College and the Wagner College Holocaust Center for being part of this conference today, dedicated to such timely and important issues. May the conference begin.
Thank you, Honorable Marjorie Steinberg. We are grateful that a Wagner College alum has played such an invaluable role in the Holocaust Center and this conference. To our esteemed audience, I too say welcome. For the fourth year, we have gathered scholars from around the globe to offer new insights into the history of the Holocaust and genocide. Previously, we have devoted a day to Holocaust heroines, rescue and resistance, and to female nurses and doctors in the Holocaust and genocide. Today, we will discuss a very wide range of issues regarding the law, its use and misuse, how it was used strategically in the past to enable genocide, and how the law has been used to try to redress issues in a post-genocide world. This academic conference is meant to be thought-provoking. Our speakers, like our audience members, represent a wide diversity of opinions, but hopefully in this respectful environment, we can learn from each other. The mission of the Wagner College Holocaust Center is to empower future generations in empathy, courage, and ethical decision-making in order to combat anti-Semitism, racism, and all forms of prejudice. This task is urgent, and we must face together challenges to democracy, to interfaith unity, and to public dialogue.
Our keynote speaker, Dr. Wolf Grunner, will draw upon the case studies in his very recent book, Resistors: How Ordinary Jews Fought Persecution in Nazi Germany, which we have available for signing and purchase just outside the door, and he will be signing books during the cocktail hour as well. Dr. Grunner reveals the astonishing and to most people deeply surprising way in which Jewish victims in Nazi Germany attempted, sometimes successfully, to use the court system to defend themselves and to resist. In the talk of Dr. Alma Begidshevich, she speaks of the failures of restorative justice to redress the inequalities of class that have left victims of the genocide in Bosnia vulnerable and uncompensated. Today, our panelists will speak of the widest range of crimes, from unspeakable acts of sexual violence in Rwanda and Yugoslavia, to economic deprivation and starvation in Germany, to killing with bare hands or clubs. We will hear of cases where restorative justice has been somewhat effective, as in the Akayesu conviction in Rwanda, or ineffective, as in the former Yugoslavia. Before we begin, we must thank the many people who contributed so much to making this conference happen. First, to our wonderful conference committee, Charles DiStefano, Faye Paris, Heather Butts, Jay Duskin, Honorable Karen Wolf, Honorable Marjorie Steinberg, and Stephen Greenwald. Would you please stand for a moment? It is Karen's hard work that assured CLE credit for today's program, and we thank the Richmond County Bar Association for sponsoring it. And a special thanks to Charles DiStefano, president of the Staten Island Trial Lawyers Association, for partnering with us each summer for a pre-law program with high school students.
We thank our partners in this undertaking, Thomas Kendrick Esquire, Chair of the Wagner College Board of Trustees and Class of 1978, and his wife, Donna Kendrick, Class of 82. Victor and Kim Avis, and Leo Ullman for our inaugural Emily Ullman Summer Scholarship. We are grateful for your generosity. Our program lists several Holocaust centers and legal associations that have offered their support. As always, Dan Glassman has volunteered to make our PowerPoints and videos run smoothly. Many colleagues at Wagner College have offered their help and services, including Lisa Campanelli, Desiree Braithwaite, Caitlin Gerton, Robert Saltman, and our wonderful interns who are here, James Merlino and Shalea Brower. Ruth Kupperberg is our inaugural Solidarity Fellow. Where are you, Ruth? A position supported for the first time by a partnership of the Wagner College Holocaust Center, the New York City Commission on Human Rights, and the Mayor's Office Against Hate Crimes. We also want to thank all the members of our faculty who've made time to be here, the chair of the Wagner College Holocaust Center Advisory Committee, Fern Zagor, and other members who will be here later today, including Michelle Lee, and Karen Wolf, Jay Duskin. Did we say that already? Okay. We urge our audience to remember the hostages as we listen to the lessons of the Holocaust. We keep them in mind as a symbolic empty chair in the room.
Okay, it is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Wolf Grunner. Dr. Grunner is the Chappell Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies and Professor of History at the University of Southern California, Los Angeles since 2008, and the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research since 2014. He's an appointed member of the Academic Committee at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum since 2017. He is the author of 11 books, among them Jewish Forced Labor Under the Nazis, Economic Needs and Nazi Racial Aims with Cambridge University Press in 2006, Parias de la Patria, El Mito de la Liberación de los Indígenas en la República de Bolivia, and the prize-winning The Holocaust in Bohemia and Moravia, Czech Initiatives, German Policies, Jewish Responses of 2019. He co-edited 4 books, including Resisting Persecution, Jews and Their Petitions During the Holocaust in 2020, and New Perspectives on Kristallnacht After 80 Years, the Nazi Pogrom in Global Comparison in 2019. His new book, a National Jewish Book Award finalist, is called Resistors: How Ordinary Jews Fought Hitler's Persecution, put out by Yale University Press in 2023. Please welcome him. This one. We can start. Let's see.
Okay. First, thank you to Lori and Laura for kind of organizing this event, and I'm grateful to be invited back here after participating in a conference on women's resistance during the Holocaust 2 years ago. And my talk is a little bit less about how Jews used the court system, but rather how the law was used to suppress Jewish resistance. So I want to change your perspective on this. And what I want to do in this talk is first to introduce you to one of the main stories in the book. There are 5 main stories. Then I will show you a little bit why we actually have forgotten this kind of individual resistance. And then I give you an overview of the different types of individual Jewish resistance we kind of fail to recognize. So I want you to kind of transport back into the Second World War. Picture the end of 1940. That means Nazis had already occupied half of Europe. In the city of Frankfurt, Hans Oppenheimer, who was a 17-year-old boy, broke the curfew every night. He went out into the pitch black dark because there was brownout because of the Allied bombing raids. And he waited until the Allied bombers circled kind of around Frankfurt. And when he heard the first explosions, he rushed to the next fire alarm post and rang the fire alarm. This was a wrong fire alarm because he tried to divert the firefighters from the actual burning houses. So how did he come actually to this, situation and decision to resist the persecution in this way? He was the son of a merchant in Frankfurt. The family was well off until 1933. He went to first a public school, but then his parents enrolled him in 1933 when Hitler took power into a private Jewish school, which was very famous, one of the most well-known private schools in Germany, the Philanthropien, founded by the Rothschild family in the 19th century. And after several years in middle school, he finished with very good grades in 1937. However, he didn't go to high school. He decided to get an apprenticeship for two reasons. The first reason was short-term. He wanted to kind of acquire a craft to sustain his family because his father had lost his kind of business. The situation in Frankfurt was extremely hostile towards Jews, and this was what triggered his kind of long-term goal with the apprenticeship. He wanted to prepare for an immigration because he didn't see a future in Germany anymore. So when he finished successfully again, kind of the education as a blacksmith, he went to the labor office in Frankfurt to get a job. And this is the spring of 1939, so several months after Kristallnacht. When he came to the labor office didn't give him a job. They actually recruited him for one of the early forced labor camps for Jews. And remember, he was just 16 years old. He spent several months in the first labor camp, was going back to Frankfurt, then transported again to another labor camp, where he spent almost a year. And this labor camp was extremely, the conditions, labor and living conditions were terrible for the Jewish forced laborers. The mayor was extremely hostile who ran the camp. He was ordering beatings of the forced labor to enhance their productivity. He segregated them from the town population. And the conditions were so bad that one of the forced laborers committed suicide in this camp. The camp was part of a larger early forced labor program, which was targeting Jews who were unemployed and received unemployment benefits. In summer 1939, already 20,000 Jewish males in Germany performed forced labor at road construction sites, garbage removal, and street cleanings. That's not so well known. It's part of my previous research. So after this experience of this young boy for almost 2 years in forced labor camps, he came back to Frankfurt in the fall of 1940. And this is when he decided to do something against the regime. And he went out, as I said, every day, broke the curfew. Sometimes twice he rang the alarm. When the firefighters came, realized there was nothing left, then he rang the fire alarm again, until the moment that the Gestapo caught him. Unfortunately, he never kind of went far away from his home because of the curfew, because he was scared of the patrolling police. So he ran into a trap right in front of a fire alarm post. He was arrested in December 1940. He spent 4 months in pre-trial detention, and then he was received an indictment by the Frankfurt prosecutor. The Frankfurt prosecutor charged him with several felonies, and specifically for offenses under the new war decree against public vermins. And Hans had admitted only to 9 fire alarms, wrong fire alarms, under the interrogation by the Gestapo. However, the prosecutor pointed out in the indictment that he was probably responsible by far more incidents, because when he came back from the labor camp, a series of wrong fire alarms started, which mounted to the total number of 44. And somehow mysteriously, the series ended when he was arrested. Yeah. So they tried actually to indict him with treason and bring him to the notorious People's Court in Berlin, but they could not really establish grounds for treason for these kind of wrong fire alarms. So the prosecutor ended up charging or indicting him and proposed the punishment of 6 years in penitentiary. 6 years. Because he had kind of acted as an enemy of the German people. On trial, he had no defense lawyer present, so he defended himself. He was now kind of 18 years old. In the end, he received a punishment of 3 years in a regular prison, not in a penitentiary, which was good for him because the judge actually didn't apply adult law as requested by the prosecutors. He had no criminal offense. So this was kind of used to lower the sentence for him, which is interesting if you think about this very late kind of in the war, under kind of Nazi circumstances, so to speak. However, the judge also emphasized in the verdict that Hans should have paid special attention to the law as a guest in Germany because he was a Jew. His family lived for generations in Frankfurt, just saying. So he was transferred to a regular prison in a small town far away from Frankfurt. And there immediately he was held in solitary confinement. He lived in isolation for 2 years, which took a heavy toll on him mentally and also physically. He developed several illnesses. There was no health care in jail. And the kind of conditions were so bad, he petitioned several times and complained with the prison warden without success, and ended up committing or attempting to commit suicide twice, but he was saved by guards. At the end of 1940, the Reich Minister of Justice in Germany and the head of the SS came to an agreement to move all Jewish prisoners from regular prisons in Germany to concentration camps. And at the end of 1942, this meant not to Dachau or Buchenwald inside Germany, but to Auschwitz. So he was transported to Auschwitz, and because of his weakened state, he didn't survive for long. After 3 weeks, he perished on January 30th, 1943. This was just mere days after he turned 20 years old. So what can tell us this story of Hans Oppenheimer about how Jews responded to the persecution in the Third Reich? Throughout the whole time in the 1930s and 40s, Nazis complained about the so-called impudent Jew in their official reports, the Gestapo, the SS, but also mayors. For example, in March 1935, the Gestapo in Aachen reported that, quote, the numbers of Jews who had sent letters and protested in person has become quite numerous and in their tone often impudent, end of quote. Historians, including myself, we always thought this kind of frequent mentioning of the impudent Jew was just a pretext to introduce new, more radical measures against the Jews. But there was some kind of truth to these allegations. For example, in July 1935, the Gestapo in Berlin wrote in a report that Jews are born with disrespect to state authority. The same month, the same Gestapo in Berlin arrested 100 Jews, more than 100 Jews actually, for offenses against the Nazi state and the Nazi party. You see, there is a connection here. Years later during the war, like Hans Oppenheimer, 1,200 Jews, men and women, were imprisoned in regular prisons in Germany. For the remaining number of Jews in Germany, this was kind of a very high number, high percentage. This would be, when you take the population of the US, it would be 6 million prisoners for resistance. 6 million, yeah? So I think my research strongly challenges that Jews in general, but particularly German Jews, did not resist the terrors of the Third Reich. The traditional idea of Jewish passivity resulted, I think, from two main reasons. One was a conceptual one, and one is kind of based on a lack of sources. So Jewish resistance has been discussed during the Holocaust, mainly by historians as group resistance, armed resistance, like uprisings, the partisans, but also mostly focusing on Eastern Europe, not on Germany proper. And secondly, historians have used a limited source pool of sources. Mainly, they used the same reports, which I already mentioned, by Gestapo and SS, and they didn't really want to emphasize Jewish resistance. And then, on the other hand, they used ego documents like testimonies, but mostly letters and diaries. And especially letters and diaries almost never mentioned acts of resistance because of fear of censorship. So what I did in my book and in my research is to kind of redefine Jewish resistance. And I did something very simple, which is also not kind of original kind of invention by me. It's based on previous work on Israeli scholars and also Australian scholars. I added just individual to kind of open up a new perspective of acts of resistance. And in my view, this changes everything. So I want to illustrate this a little bit with some photographs. So the first photograph is very widely known. A Jewish lawyer in Munich was dragged through the city in March 1933 by stormtroopers. We use this usually as an illustration for the first wave of terror. But look at the person in the middle. He has a sign around his neck. And the sign says, "I won't complain at the police station anymore." What he did was he wanted to release a client who was arrested by the police. So this was a deliberate act of terror and not a random one. Or this picture. I used this picture in my class to illustrate the initiative role of municipalities, for example, to forbid access to public parks, but also swimming pools. But after thinking about individual resistance, I revisited this photograph and look at her body language. Why would she even take a picture or let somebody take a picture of herself in front of a humiliating kind of situation? Or this one, the family here in a small town in Western Germany let their son take a picture in front of their house where 2 days prior there was this notorious anti-Jewish slogan kind of painted on the wall. Why would they take a picture? And this is the cover of the book, my favorite photograph. This is Lizzie Rosenfeld in Vienna. She is a Jewish woman, and I don't know who reads German, but the sign on the bench says, "Not for Jews." I mean, translated, it's only for Aryans, yeah? So not for Jews. So a Jewish woman sits demonstratively on a bench only for Aryans. Look at her body language, how she embraces, kind of say, "Look, yeah, here." And then she lets her friend take the picture, and then she smuggles the negative out of Austria when she emigrates to the United States. And it goes even further. Even these kind of images are acts of resistance themselves. For example, this next photograph is taken by the owner of this destroyed apartment, which was vandalized during Kristallnacht. He took Hans Sachs, he took this as to document the crime, which in itself is again an act of resistance. So what I did in my research is kind of a deep dive into local German archives. I used police records, court records on the one hand. So interestingly, perpetrator records to actually recover Jewish agency, which is kind of seems counterintuitive. But I also added 170 testimonies from the USC Shoah Foundation of German Jewish survivors. So let me spend the rest of the time to introduce you to the variety of individual acts of resistance in Nazi Germany. What I came up with are 5 different types of resistance, which I kind of created, which almost entirely cover the huge variety of different individual acts. So I will talk in the remaining time about each of these kind of different types with a few examples. So the first one is challenging kind of anti-Jewish propaganda and Nazi propaganda. So imagine Jews actually were arrested for ripping down Nazi flags, for besmearing displays of anti-Semitic newspapers, for destroying anti-Jewish posters. And this is true not only for the beginning, the 1930s, but also still true for the wartime. Yeah, there's not a big difference between the 30s and the 40s here. And the story in the book is about David Bornstein. He was a merchant in Hamburg. And one summer day, he went with his wife to a bus terminal at the outskirts of Hamburg. And they waited for the departure of the bus because she wanted to visit her parents. And they were standing there. And while standing and waiting for the bus, David Bornstein tried to destroy the swastika logo on the public bus. This is a Gestapo picture, and I hope you can see this, that on the swastika you see scratches there, right? So with his walking stick, with his cane, he tried to kind of scratch the swastika, and this looked like this. And this is not David Bornstein. This is one of the first attempts of historical reenactment by the Gestapo. It's a Gestapo officer who impersonates David Bornstein. And then up in the window, which is the place where his wife was sitting, this is actually the bus conductor who denunciated David Bornstein. So David Bornstein was put on trial. He received 5 weeks in jail for this kind of material destruction of a public symbol. And later was put, because he had a criminal record, into a concentration camp. And when he survived the months until his release, he immediately left Germany with his wife and his daughter. Next category is oral protest. There are tons of kind of files where Jews were arrested and put on trial, men and women, for criticizing the Nazi regime, insulting Hitler, specifically kind of complaining or protesting against anti-Jewish measures like laws and violent events. And this starts in 1933 when Jews publicly criticized the first wave of terror, but then also goes on and has kind of spikes at certain events like Kristallnacht. So for example, in Frankfurt, the over 50-year-old Henriette Schäfer, she visited or went to a shop the morning after Kristallnacht. And she asked the store owner what he would think about the previous night, the destruction of shops and the arsoning of the synagogues. And the shop owner says along the Nazi propaganda lines, yeah, this is the outrage of the German people because a Jew assassinated our diplomat in Paris. And I quote here, she says, "This is not the people. This is the government. They are all blackguards, scums, and criminals. Hitler is the biggest bandit. If I could, I would poison them all." End of quote. She was put on trial and she was receiving 6 months in prison under this law, the law against treacherous attacks against the Nazi state and the Nazi party. We thought that this law was actually enacted to quell resistance by communists and social democrats. My research shows that dozens and dozens of Jews in every city I visit the archive of were actually punished under this law, especially for public critique and public protest. And just to share a picture of one of the courageous women there, this is Gabriele Reich. She received 10 months in prison by the special court in Vienna for insulting Hitler, criticizing anti-Jewish laws, and listening to foreign broadcasts. Written protest, there's a big variety which reaches from petitions against certain laws, against kind of the persecution in general. And I think we need to revisit also what petitions are, because we usually discarded them as written in vain, but they were the only political tool Jews had legally to actually protest. And they signed them under risk with their own names. And when we look at these petitions, we need to realize they not only ask for being exempt from a rule or from a law, they also reclaim their own status as citizens, as Germans, as contributors to the fatherland, as people who pay taxes, who were part of the German culture. So these petitions in itself kind of were also an act of resistance. On the far other end, there are anonymous leaflets. And in 1935 in Berlin, there were riots against Jews. Shop owners petitioned the police president against the violence, but also anonymous leaflets surfaced. And this is the police report about one of those. And this one said, quote, "German is a cultural disgrace today. I'm a German Jew and loyal to the emperor. In fact, the Germans should expel the foreigner Hitler. Down with Hitler, exclamation mark," end of quote. The story in the book is about Benno Neuburger. Benno Neuburger was a 70-year-old man. He was a former real estate broker. He lost his business not because of the Nazis, but because of the hyperinflation. He suffered from the immigration of his children, so he never saw his grandchild. He never was witnessing the marriage of his kids. He and his wife lived in Munich and waited to get out and never made it out. And the last straw for him was the introduction of the Yellow Star. After the introduction of the Yellow Star in September 1941, 1 week later, he started to use these post stamps here and put them on postcards and wrote abusive comments on them, like those. It says, "Hitler, murderer, bandit," on the left side, "the eternal murderer Hitler," disgusting exclamation mark. And the most pathetic one was on the right side. It says, "Murderer of 5 million." And this was a moment, this was in December 1941, where not much information about the first massacre in the East had reached Germany yet. So this was very prophetic. Unfortunately, he made a mistake. He used one of the postcards of his former real estate firm, and the Gestapo caught him. He was interrogated by the Gestapo, and if you look closely, the mugshot actually revealed that he was tortured. You see a bruise under his eye. But still under torture, he would cling to his kind of position that he hated Hitler because Hitler persecuted the Jews in Germany. For this, he was transferred from Munich to Berlin. He was put on a show trial at the notorious People's Court, which was the most kind of notorious Nazi court. And the show trial punished him with the death penalty, and he was decapitated in September 1942 for these postcards. Defying anti-Jewish laws, remember the story of Hans Oppenheimer. He falls under this category. There's a huge variety from visiting, kind of breaking local restrictions, like visiting public parks or libraries, to kind of ignoring laws. And for example, one surprising result of my research was that seemingly obvious things happened. So for example, remember, Jews had to adopt the discriminatory middle name Sarah and Israel. However, even under the Nazis, Jews would not easily adopt them or just live the next day with these names. They had to fill out forms, pay 3 Reichsmark, and apply for a legal name change. And many Jews just didn't do it. I found in all the archives in each city I visited, dozens and dozens of files and records that Jews were kind of persecuted for not adopting the names. And interestingly here, the elderly were actually the most active in this regard. And so, for example, in Leipzig, only in 1941, this kind of regulation was enacted in 1939. In 1941, 2 years later, Ida Schneider, a 73-year-old woman, was detected by the Gestapo that she would not kind of carry this discriminatory middle name, and also had not kind of an ID card with a J. she went to prison for this. So Max Mannheimer was one of those who, for example, as a forced laborer, still kind of broke several kind of regulations like visiting public parks, breaking the curfew, and he, in the public park, ripped actually anti-Jewish signs out of the ground. So the last category is physical self-defense, and this was the most kind of surprising for me. So there's not much in the German archives, but the testimonies of the Shoah Foundation tell a lot of stories, how men got into brawls with stormtroopers, Jewish men kind of beat up Nazi neighbors who harassed kind of Jewish tenants. And the story in the book is about, oh, and I have to mention, a lot of Jewish teenagers in school defended themselves physically against assaults by Hitler Youth or neighborhood kids. And the story in the book is about Daisy Gudanovsky. It's also a teenager. She was 16 years old and was from Berlin, but lived at the time of Kristallnacht in a retraining camp where she prepared for the immigration to Palestine. And they were educated to get agricultural kind of skills to have better immigration chances. So during Kristallnacht, most of these retraining camps were actually raided by stormtroopers. They destroyed the facilities and beat up the teachers and the teenagers. And the situation now, what I will show you a video, what she is talking about is that after the stormtroopers beat up all the male teenagers, they also started to beat up the girls. Oh. So just to explain the situation, she had jiu-jitsu training, self-defense training prior to moving to the camp back in Berlin by the Hashomer Hatzair group she was a member of. So that kind of, she applied in this kind of altercation. She was actually caught twice after she ran away, but made it out to the Jewish community in Cologne, and that's when she was put on a train and ended up in England and then later on the United States. That's how she survived. So to summarize, defining resistance as any individual or group action against Nazi laws, actions, and intentions changes our perspective. And I hope you agree now after the talk with me. Although my research brought to light an incredible amount of courageous acts, countless cases are still kind of unknown. Because I will, in the one-man show, many archives are still untouched, and some never left traces because they were not denunciated. Interestingly, and I think this is one of the main results of my research, there is no pattern who can resist. It's equally men and women, young and old, blue-collar workers, but also high kind of wealthy people. Every Jewish man and woman developed particular responses over time, also changing, but they were direct responses to the persecution. And as I showed, most of these acts can be subsumed or under these 5 categories, which I shared with you. Some might question if the small acts really deserve to be called resistance. However, the research for the book really shows that it only matters what the Nazis actually thought about them. And the harsh kind of punishments of seemingly small acts showed that the Nazis actually perceived those as real threats. The stories of Jewish resistance surprisingly reveal frequent unexpected behavior of non-Jews too, and especially, as I showed a little bit, in the legal system. So what we thought earlier, that there is this steady Nazification of the court system, of prosecutors and judges, is only partly true. There was still leeway for individuals in the legal system, in the court system, to act. So interesting is that my research shows that even late into the war, like 1941, 1942, the Nazis still stuck to their legal system. And Jews were punished in courts. They were not thrown into concentration camps, as sometimes is assumed. And it shows also that the majority of judges kind of stuck to these kind of legal matters. They used the law which was existing and had also leeway how to interpret the law. And this is true not only for regular courts, but even for the special courts which were established in 1933, and we thought were the kind of preeminent Nazi courts. But even there, and because they tried especially the public protest against the persecution, even there we see Jews got sometimes lower sentencing if the witnesses were not deemed reliable, or they were even acquitted. So I found dozens of circumstances where actually Jews, while insulting or after insulting Hitler, were still acquitted because they could not kind of, the procedure didn't fulfill what the law demanded, which was surprising to me. So I think not only that the court system in a way was used to repress persecution, resistance, but it also allowed individuals in the court system to kind of respond differently and also to show sympathy in some cases to the defendants. And the Jews, on the other hand, could also use the court system. And while my book doesn't focus so much on it, I will share one incident. So even in 1940, Jewish forced laborers in Berlin went to a labor court and sued a private employer for payments on Nazi holidays. And they won. So to appreciate and commemorate the courageous efforts of countless German Jews, I think we need to kind of complicate our Holocaust narrative. We need to add these types of individual resistance. And I think this enables us to really see Jewish men and women in Nazi Germany as historical actors. And I think this kind of obliterates the idea of Jewish passivity once and for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that absolutely fascinating talk. And I'm now going to introduce the next speaker. Sign up this. Okay. Dr. Alma Begicevic, adjunct instructor at the Sociology Department in Loyola University, is a Chicago-based interdisciplinary scholar and legal researcher known for her contributions to constitutional law, political economy, human rights, and work in post-genocide, post-colonial transitions with a specific focus on Bosnia and Herzegovina. Her research spans various topics, including peace and accountability processes, constitution making, war reparations, and the rights of victims. By exploring complex issues at the intersection of law, politics, economy, and societal structures, she enriches our understanding of post-conflict changes and challenges Bosnia and Herzegovina face to provide generalizable recommendations to other post-war contexts. Dr. Begicevic's dedication to critical inquiry to investigate the connections between past, present, and future, between money, justice, and victims' recognition underscores her commitment to advancing scholarship in the pursuit of human rights, especially for historically oppressed and vulnerable groups. Her work has been featured in the International Journal of Constitutional Law, Law and Policy, International Review of Victimology, and the International Institute for Sociology and Law, among others. Please join us. Do you have a PowerPoint? Did you load it? Okay. So do I need to go into my email?
Yeah, you emailed it to Laura?
Okay.
Go ahead.
There's the. How come it's not in the,
You go.
okay.
You should be in there. No, we got it, we got it. Yeah. Oh, you want to click it? Yeah, oh, she wants a clicker.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
And Mike, there you go.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm deeply grateful to Wagner College, especially to Lori Weintraub and Laura Morowitz for envisioning, organizing, and making this remarkable panel possible. To my fellow speakers and esteemed guests, thank you for joining us today to discuss the Holocaust and genocide and their enduring impact on human lives. Before I start, I would like to share with you the map of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Many of us know a little bit about what happened there, that there was some sort of conflict, but it is oftentimes worthwhile to see geography and where we are located. You can see on the map that Bosnia and Herzegovina, which I will click on here with my clicker if it works, maybe not, just across from, you see the boot sign, that is Italy, and we have Adriatic coast that is separating Bosnia and Herzegovina from Italy, and is bordering on the west side by Croatia, which is neighboring to Austria, and then on the east side, we have Serbia. On the south side of the country, we have Montenegro, and further down, we have Albania and Greece, right? And so this is the geography of where the country is located. I wanted to first, before I go into my presentation, give a caveat before I begin that today I speak in my personal capacity, and nothing I share here can be attributed to Loyola University Chicago or any other institution I may be affiliated with. Also, another caveat, I will be speaking about sexual violence as well. It is part of what happened in Bosnia. So if there is anybody who may be triggered or uncomfortable with this conversation, I'll give you a moment to leave the room now. And also, another thing I wanted to share before I go into my research and background about Bosnia is that it is important to put this conversation in context. What we have today going on is, according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee Human Rights experts, persecution, conflict, violence, human rights violations, and events that are disturbing public order, resulting in historically high number of people who have been forced to flee their homes. There is need for strengthening coordinated action and work to protect asylum seekers, refugees, and there is a need for increased promotion and implementation of international human rights, both norms and standards. We have about 50 million people who are refugees and asylum seekers around the world and in need of protection. With the development of technology, we today are able to actually see personally and witness mass atrocities committed in distant part of the world. An aftermath of Bosnian war really gives us deeper understanding the consequences of such atrocities will persist long after the conflict's end. Now I'll go on to the more contemporary map of Bosnia. You see on the side where we have the city of Sarajevo, how it has been rehabilitated after the war. It's very difficult to see traces of what happened there, right? Sarajevo is located in the valley. It is surrounded by mountains. It is important for what we are going to talk about next because of how the city is located strategically. It's quite important. You see, east side of the city is basically surrounded by mountains. The west side is that yellow building that you see kind of spreading around what is L-shaped kind of architecture is from Austro-Hungarian period, and it's a national library. Some of you who remember Bosnia remember that that was one of the first buildings to be set on fire. The other side really tells us how Bosnia and Herzegovina is kind of shaped from internally, right, in terms of geography. You see, Sarajevo is the capital, and we today have east side of the country predominantly governed by Bosnian Serbs, and the west side of the country is predominantly under the government and administration of federation, which consists of Bosnian government and also those who constitute ethnically Croats or by religion Christian Catholics and others. What we see in Bosnia and Herzegovina are the consequences of mass atrocities that have persisted long after conflict ended. It's been almost 30 years. 30 years after the war, still the Ministry of Human Rights and Refugees cannot determine the exact number of displaced persons. Over 96,000 individuals remain internally displaced. 7,000 continue to live in inhuman conditions. We have 7,000 people whose remains are still not found. Their remains, some of their remains are, it is expected to be scattered in mass graves around different countries, including Serbia, Montenegro, and parts of Bosnia. The apartheid regime in Bosnia, with its ethnically segregated areas, high unemployment rate, political corruption, poor quality of healthcare and education, genocide denial, and ethnic tensions continue to destabilize the country. So the situation 30 years after is not that great. I'll give you a little bit of background because I think I will give you also a little bit of understanding of what my research is all about, but I feel that some of us may not necessarily be so familiar with history of Bosnia, so I'll take some time to walk you through history and then tell you what is the relevance of this for today. These are some of the images I'd like to share with you. They are recorded in Sarajevo during the war, and you see the level of destruction of the city that I've just showed you pictures of a minute ago. Major infrastructure was completely destroyed. We have historically the conflict that we can start to see unfold was already happening in the 1980. with the death of a political leader who was in power for 40 years and was beloved by many, Tito, was really creating a political gap. After his death in 1980, there wasn't really a political leader who is going to emerge to take over federal entities that were very much diverse. And so what we saw is gap in political power. This gap resulted in the rise of far right and nationalism, very specific to ethno-religious kind of national type of nationalism that we see specifically in former Yugoslavia. So after this political power gap and the rise of nationalism, we had first Slovenia and Croatia declare independence from the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Bosnia was to follow later, and in February 29th of 1992, Bosnia and Herzegovina had a referendum with about 99.7% of the votes cast in Bosnia and Herzegovina favoring independence from Yugoslavia. This is about 63.4% of eligible voters who came to express their political opinion to separate from former Yugoslavia. It's also important to note that Serb communities abstained from voting. Bosnia and Herzegovina declared its independence on March 3rd of 1992, and it was recognized first by the European Community, which is now European Union, and that recognition came on April 6th of 1992, and then later the recognition came only a day after from the United States. So Bosnia and Herzegovina became an independent sovereign country with its own capped historic borders that resulted in major consequences that you can see here. The Declaration of Independence triggered a violent political conflict as Bosnian Serbs supported by the Yugoslav People's Army began attacks to secure Serb-dominated territories. This conflict escalated into the Bosnian War, lasting from 92 to 95, and many Bosnians would say that actually the conflict ended in 1996 because that's when the siege of Sarajevo ended. The loss in infrastructure you see here. You also see some of the images here that show some sort of resistance, right, that we just had discussed a minute ago. You have wonderfully dressed women walking through the streets of the city that is completely destroyed, resisting to face that reality that they should submit to that level of violence. You see at the bottom a father who is carrying their child after escaping the sniping fire that is all located on the hills around the city of Sarajevo. So you see these forms of violence and destruction resulting in significant loss of life. There's widespread material destruction and profound humanitarian crisis. What we saw here is about 100,000 people who were murdered in Bosnia. Half of total population was uprooted. People were forced to flee their homes. Many were fleeing their homes under extreme violence. Universities, national libraries, religious sites, hospitals, bridges, and national infrastructure were all completely or in part destroyed. The maternity hospital in Sarajevo was one of the first buildings to go. And we see here that patients were kept in extreme conditions. But in Bosnia, we have very harsh winters, and patients were kept in very cruel conditions of freezing temperatures with no heating available, so only humanitarian blankets were able to protect them. The point of this destruction of material conditions of life were really to prevent access to healthcare, which was quite important when you have destruction of life happening at the same time. There were no hospitals functioning to provide quality care to people who were wounded and injured. These are the CIA reports from 1993 that give us a little bit of background of the types of violence and the levels of violence that we have seen there. Intentional destruction of homes, religious sites. We see systematic, intentional violence targeting groups of people. And then from there, I move on to sexual violence. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, we had about 50,000 women approximately. You know that with sexual violence, we can never get accurate numbers because of the stigma and other types of pressures the victims are facing. So many of them will never speak to what happened to them. But we have approximate numbers. They go to different accounting processes depending on the source, but we estimate that about 50,000 women and girls were subjected to systematic rape, torture, and forced impregnation. We also know that victims as young as 6 were subjected to sexual violence. Here we have the picture of Biljana Plavšić. She was one of the Bosnian Serb leaders who was a professor of biology and a former political leader in the Bosnian Serb, so-called SDS, Serb Democratic Party. She was considered radical even by the notorious Slobodan Milošević. She considered Muslims a racial group who are genetically deformed. And this really is a statement that she gave in 1993 in the midst of the war for Novi Sad newspaper, in which she said, "It is true, Bosniaks are genetically deformed material that embraced Islam. Now with each hereditary generation, that gene became concentrated. It gets worse and worse. It simply becomes expressive and dictates their style of thinking and behavior, which is rooted in their genes." What happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina is that unlike in many conflicts where sexual violence, unfortunately, is common byproduct of war, where women are used to alter ethnic composition of the population, right? They're used to harm communities. They are used to inflict pain to the group of people. Here we have a strategy that is targeting not just women alone, but it really is targeting genes, right? There we have combination of rape and sadism that is intentional to break community and uses this genetic material kind of approach to doing so. The strategy is intended to contaminate the Bosnian Muslim population with Serb genetic material, reflecting a horrifying attempt at biological and also cultural contamination. What we see here also is that what we know, about 4,000 children were born out of rape. So this population is highly invisible and is becoming now quite relevant for a discourse of victims' rights in Bosnia. Some of these young women, in this case, there are also men who are coming forward. Aina Jusic and Leila Damon. Leila Damon was adopted by British journalists who have raised her and at the age of 18 told her about her mother and about the origin of how she was born. And they became quite important leaders for this particular group of young people who are absolutely invisible in this community to give voice and request recognition for their own status as a group that requires human rights protection. You have here another example, which I will just briefly mention without going into details, the kind of pain that is inflicted on young girls aged 15 and 17 here, required to watch their own family members being raped in front of them in order to inflict pain to the entire community and families. I'll move to that, from that to the image that probably resonates with many of you, the armbands in which non-Serb population was marked visibly. These pictures are from the town called Prijedor, in which local Serb authorities in this town ordered through local radio that all non-Serb inhabitants must mark their houses by placing white cloth on their houses and in front of their houses. And also anytime they leave homes, they should wear the white armband to differentiate themselves from Serb population. In this particular town alone, over 3,000 people were murdered, including 102 children. This is a very small town, so the population is not, of large size as a capital of Sarajevo, for instance. But about 30,000 people in this town alone were tortured in concentration camps called Ternopolje, Omarska, and Karaterm. And I'll show you some pictures that come from there. You see images of people here who were subjected to torture, forced confinement, unsanitary conditions, forced labor. They were used as human shields and subjected to starvation. Children in Bosnia were also subjected to systematic intentional harm, killed by snipers, and civilians endured freezing temperatures, as I mentioned previously. Another problem we have is that we see mass graves in which people's bodies were scattered around different areas, so having proper burial was quite difficult. And I have 1 minute to wrap up. The point is, Bosnian case gives us an example of thinking about post-genocide reality. You see, the harms that people have endured are really complex. The level of trauma is pretty serious. And what we see is structural inequality emerging after genocide. There is limited reach of criminal justice. There is reality of genocide denial. There is state restructuring, socioeconomic and cultural marginalization in which victims who have survived genocide find themselves facing extreme forms of poverty, lack of healthcare, lack of agency to represent themselves in the government and be able to have a voice. There is absence of victims reparation program, and that's what I'm interested in. And I will close with this point. Well, we have $13 billion spent on international programs, and they are quite important in having international accountability programs run. We also have very little programs directly targeting victims to ensure that they have access to healthcare, they have access to pension funds. And this is where I am interested in my research and looking at post-genocide realities and what transformation of society brings for victims. And I will close here. Thank you for allowing me to go a minute over time. I will be happy to take any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alma. We'd like to invite everyone now just for a 10-minute quick break. We have coffee, we have some water, we have a little bit of, I think, mini quiche. So let's take a 10-minute break, and we will try to do the questions at the end of the very end of the conference. That would be, kindly take your seats for the second panel. We promise that we will have Dr. Gruner selling the books again at the cocktail hour. If I could have your attention for a moment, if anyone has arrived who is here for CLE credit, please make sure that you see Tim right there. He's raising his hand. Please do make sure that you check in with him for the CLE credit. And we're going to get started now. So I'm going to invite Lori Weintraub to come and introduce our speaker. Lori? And there, as I said, we'll continue with the book sale and the refreshments afterwards.
Thank you again for coming today, and thank you to the first two speakers. We still have two more speakers and 4 comments. And now it is my honor to spend a moment thinking about the 30th anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda. Throughout this year, we have held a series of programs to honor and memorialize the genocide, including for over 500 students this past April at the St. George Theater. As many of you know, on April 7th, 1994, a terrible tragedy, the state's sanctioned discrimination by the Hutu-led regime in Rwanda escalated to genocide. In the first 30 days of the genocide against the Tutsi, 50,000 men, women, and children were killed because of their ethnicity in just the first 30 days. Within 100 days, nearly 1 million Tutsi were murdered. Among the living and the dead were many women tragically raped by Hutu militants. There had been warnings in the spreading of the, quote, Hutu 10 Commandments, and in those months of the need to block radio signals, to ban arms shipments, to offer more protection in earlier years before the genocide erupted. The world was wrongly silent. Yet as Jacqueline Murataketa, did I say it right? Murataketa has said, quote, there were people who stood up. And today, she says, I try to increase the number of people who stand up to injustices. And in the post-genocide era, the testimony and legal battles from the Rwandan genocide have in fact reshaped international law and the history of women and genocide. And as a small example of the resistance of women, in addition to the writing and speaking about the Rwandan genocide, we offer you this display of sisal peace baskets created by women in Rwanda, which portray the image of 2 women holding hands in the decoration on the basket as a symbol of unity and hope for Rwanda's future. And so we ask you all to think about Kwibuka. Kwibuka is the word in Rwanda for remember. And we ask you to take a minute of silence to remember those who were brutalized, those whose lives were cut short by the genocide, those who lost family members, and finally to inspire us to be like those who were upstanders. Kwibuka, remember, we remember. And now I'd like to call upon the moderator of our second panel and our next speaker, Faye Yvette Paris, Esquire. Ms. Paris is an international law consultant, immigration law practitioner, and writer with experience in international human rights law. Sorry. She has served as a visiting professional with the ICC International Criminal Court, Office of the Prosecutor, where she advised the court on modalities for prosecuting gender-based violence which occurred in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and has been a supervising attorney with the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights as an advocate for unaccompanied immigrant children. In 2021 and to 2022, she served as president of the Queens County Women's Bar Association and is serving in her 20th year as co-chair of the Women's Bar Association of the State of New York, International Women's Rights Committee. Faye was the 2019 recipient of the Marilyn Manga Award from the New York State International Women's Rights Committee for outstanding work on behalf of the Women's Bar Association of the State of New York. Thank you, Faye.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Yes, it is my distinct pleasure to be here. I want to thank both Dr. Lori Weintraub as well as Dr. Laura Morowitz for just having and convening this most important event. Before we get started, I'm just looking for one thing. I don't see the, oh, I found it. Okay, great, the mouse. I just want to say that in 15 minutes, I'm going to cover just an overview of the gendered aspect of genocide. And I want to really focus on three important things, three takeaways for you. The first is that why is this so important? Why is this conference important? It's because people don't always get together to talk about the gendered aspects of genocide. And it's not a comfortable topic, but it's something that has to be discussed if we are ever to move beyond this phase of our historic life and move beyond where the dignity and respect for all is guaranteed and experienced in fact. So the first thing I would like to say is that besides the regular tribunals like the International Criminal Tribunal for prosecutions against Rwanda and Yugoslavia and the ICC, there are other instruments that can be availed in the international community, such as the Maputo Protocol, the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights, the Convention of Belém do Pará, the Istanbul Convention. There are standards of conduct that have to be applied by states within the domestic framework. For example, just to give you an example, recently there was a case against Jessica Linehan, domestic violence survivor. Because she didn't prevail in the courts of the United States, she took her case to the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights and then established a precedent. So number one is we have tools to utilize. The second thing is that gender-based persecution has many faces. Oftentimes, and I'm going to start with the 15-minute clock, oftentimes when we look at, let me just, is it working here? I don't know. Oh, thank you. So I want to press this one to use.
And from the beginning.
Thank you. Perfect. Okay, great. All right. Unfortunately, you see a list of countries and you see a list of genocides, but these are not all of the genocides. These only account for some of the modern day genocides, but you of course have genocides that predates even the 20th century. And what's upsetting about those genocides are that in each and every one of them, women suffered as women, men suffered as men, and many did not get to tell their stories. But number two is as follows. Usually, invariably, in most of those genocides, you had separation of women and children oftentimes, and men. Men were killed oftentimes, but the women had to stay and endure sexual violence. And not only did they have to endure, but when the wars were over, the trauma continued. And as we know, and we will discuss later, and from experts in the audience, we also have what we call, and what Dr. Yael Danieli also mentions, is multi-generational legacies of trauma. So we have to account for this as an international community. The third thing that I'd like to say is as difficult as the discussion is, it's a very necessary discussion. So I will do as my colleague did. It's a disclaimer. I am going to be addressing and mentioning some very uncomfortable topics. So if you feel that it's not something that you'd like to hear, please do, give yourself a moment to leave. All right, so before we get into a discussion, I just want to go over the definition of genocide. Oftentimes people think of genocide as killing. Well, yes, that's part of it, but Article 2 on the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide states any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So it's not just killing, it's doing anything that will kill the spirit of a group. And of course, sexual violence is within that category. So let's start with the Holocaust. Raoul Hilberg, in his publication, Perpetrators, Victims, and Bystanders, The Jewish Catastrophe, states, the road to annihilation was marked by events that specifically affected men as men and women as women. Sexual violence has many faces. It's structured, it's systematic, it's organized, it's overarching. It was intentionally inflicted to degrade, torture, humiliate, and dehumanize the victims. It was also intentionally inflicted to preserve the Aryan race, and of course, intentionally inflicted to instill fear, perpetrated regardless of age or physical condition. And what was very interesting about the sexual violence is, notwithstanding the race defilement laws of Russian Shada, I never pronounce it correctly, but race defilement, rape still existed in numbers, in countless numbers, too many. There should not be one rape. Gang rape, which was reflective of toxic masculinity, also encompassed sexual terrorism in pursuit of political aims, subjugation. Women were raped in the middle of the streets. The murderers would drag the Jewish women into the street. They would cut off their breasts in the middle of the street. And it's estimated that the number of victims exceeded the thousands. Upon entry into concentration camps, there was sexual violation in the processing, where women's genitals were being shaved. They had no autonomy of their body, not even the most intimate parts. One survivor states, we ceased to exist as thinking, feeling entities. We were not allowed any modesty in front of these strange men. We were nothing more than objects on which they performed their duties, non-sentient things that they could examine from all angles. It did not bother them that cutting hair close to the skin with dull scissors was excruciatingly painful. It did not bother them that we were women and that without our hair, we felt totally humiliated. Sexual violence also occurred in the form of camp brothels. They were known as centers for sexual violence. There was sexual violence against children, oftentimes from their foster parents, medical sexual violence, such as forcible attack on a woman's reproductive organs, forced sterilization, forced abortions, all to preserve the Aryan race. And when we talk about menstruation, it's often a topic that's not addressed, but women try to avoid being operated on or even raped by saying that they had their periods. So for example, this one woman states that Elizabeth put her sister's underwear on and showed the doctor telling him that she had her period. He refused to operate. Elizabeth realized that she could use her sister's situation to save herself from experimentation, and did so another 3 times at Auschwitz. Sexual violence in some was the propagation of those regarded as inferior, was prevented as much as possible, both inside and outside the concentration camps, and abortions and forced sterilization were the case. So what was the world at that time, and just go back many decades, what was the response to this calamity? Let's look at the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. First of all, Article 6 of the Charter of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg omitted sexual crimes in general, and specifically sexual crimes against women. If you look at Article 6, and I have it here, nowhere do you see any reference to sexual crimes or sexual violence. Let's take a look. It says the following acts, or any of them, are crimes coming within the jurisdiction of the tribunal for which there shall be individual responsibility. Well, you have crimes against the peace, which is very important to the Allies at the end of the war crimes, but there's nothing that talks about sexual violence, even crimes against humanity. What they do state is they specifically name murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts committed against any civilian population before or during the war, or persecutions. Now, we understand that rape, sexual violence can fall under the gamut of both of those highlighted in blue, but nonetheless, the question is, and it begs the question, why did they not mention specifically sexual violence? And of course, after the war, you had so many events that led to the agreement for the prosecution and punishment of the major war criminals. Here you see Justice Robert Jackson, his opening statement at Nuremberg. One of the things he talks about is the prisoners that represented sinister influences. And what's interesting is he says they are symbols of fierce nationalisms and of militarism, of intrigue and war making, which have embroiled Europe generation after generation, crushing its manhood, destroying its homes, and impoverishing its life. Now, his speech was 3 hours, so it is possible that he mentioned sexual violence. But nonetheless, that was not the focus of the tribunal. The focus was to stop the peace against humanity. It was basically, and I will say, and he talks about a well-documented history, there were, of course, unprecedented, enormous challenges. We had to get documentary evidence. Before the Allies came to an agreement to have an international tribunal, they had to make sure that what they did was really accurate so that they can document the charges that they would have against the indicted. But unfortunately, there was no reference to sexual violence. But there were some, of course, many advancements of that tribunal. It's the first time that leaders were held personally responsible for acts that were committed in their official capacity or committed while they were in their official positions. There was emphasis on the individual perpetrator, right? However, there was not emphasis on the victim's narrative, on the victim's statement. There was a lack of a feminist perspective in legal systems during this era. And basically, conflict-related sexual violence was considered to be a norm. It's an inevitable consequence of war. There was no real uniform international policy. So, you know, we divide our history into various periods. There's an era of silence where we don't talk about it. Then there's an era of honor where we do have reference to rape as a crime against a woman's honor, but it still doesn't focus in on the inherent dignity, the woman's inherent dignity as a human being. Patriarchy, and then you always have the overarching domestic versus public issue. For example, in the issue of domestic violence, public versus private issue, national versus international. And one of the prosecutors at Nuremberg who decided, we don't want to talk about sexual violence, said, the tribunal will forgive me if I avoid citing the atrocious details, just to give you an example. Now, I'm very happy that my colleague who spoke before me gave a wonderful foundation of the Yugoslav wars. So I just want to talk very briefly. Imagine this was a winner when it comes to really defining various crimes in international jurisprudence. Just imagine, you know, you had the devastating Balkans War, and then you had a tribunal based on Security Council Resolution 808 that was charged with prosecuting those most responsible for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other atrocious acts. And you had Richard Goldstone at the helm, Peggy Kuo, Patricia Sellers. All of these individuals were tasked with really coming up with not only crimes and definitions of crimes like enslavement, but actually going to witnesses and getting credible testimony so that they could appear and indict those. So what I'm going to do is just go over some of the wins of that particular tribunal. There was, and the final report of the Commission of Experts and its annexes states that there was an investigative mission on sexual violence. It was planned. It was a planned instrument of war policy. The majority of rapes occurred from April to November of '92. Sexual violence was widespread. And although perpetrated by all of the warring factors, normally the victims were Bosnian Muslims and the majority of perpetrators were Bosnian Serbs. Ethnic cleansing and rape and sexual violence, as you mentioned earlier, was used to displace and humiliate victims and survivors and their communities. And there were forced pregnancies. Ultimately, though, Through the tribunal's work, rape ceased to be perceived as the unrestrained sexual behavior of individuals and was recognized as a powerful tool of war used to intimidate, persecute, and terrorize the enemy. And so some of the novel cases, for example, the case against Dusko Tadic, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, even when I was at the ICC, I never did, but it was the first trial pertaining to sexual violence after the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals. And it was also the first trial for sexual violence against men. He oversaw a particular compound where two brothers were forced to perform fellatio on one another. So very, very, grotesque actions that he not only sanctioned, but he also encouraged others to partake in. Then the Muchik et al., 4 members of the Bosnian armed forces in the prison camp of Chalabici, I think I'm saying that correctly, but Dalik basically was one of the security guards that raped, 2 women, and rape for the first time is now seen as a crime of torture. It's a form of torture. That's a landmark case. The trial chamber in this found that the violence suffered by the 2 women had a discriminatory purpose. It was inflicted on them because they were women. And also in the Ferrandisha case, okay, this is a case, it's the first one to focus entirely on charges of sexual violence and multiple rapes of a woman during an interrogation by a defendant. The court said rape may also amount to an act of genocide if the requisite elements are met and may be prosecuted accordingly. So this is sort of a precursor to the Akayesu judgment. And the infamous Cape rape camps in Focha, where this is, and this is one of the things I want to say, the news media played a large role in bringing this to our attention when the war in the Balkans broke out in '91, because we knew what was happening in the camps, not just the starvation of men, but the rape camps against women. That stirred international attention. And it really, really, I think, contributed to victim survivors coming forward with testimony because they knew they had the support of the international press. During this time, as you saw earlier, there was expulsion through terror. And then you have also the Christie case, which established a link between rape and ethnic cleansing. For the first time, you had, and people within the tribunal had to travel all over the world to get testimonies from victim survivors. So it was very important. This is one of the platforms that enabled survivors to really talk about the crimes that they experienced and the violations that they experienced. But again, as we know, not everyone came forward. And in some, many years later, well into their 70s, decades after the attack occurred, more than 1/3 of those convicted by the ICTY were found guilty for crimes involving sexual violence. Let's talk about the Rwanda genocide. And we know the background of the genocide. It started in 1994, in April, after the plane of the president was shot down. I'm going to go through this very quickly, but I want to focus on the first case where there's a conviction for rape as genocide against Jean-Paul Akayesu. The name of the case was Prosecutor versus Jean-Paul Akayesu. That was the case docket number. He was the Burgmaster of Taba Commune in April of '93 through June of '94. He was responsible for everything. And not only that, if you look at the records and the minutes, I've read the entire judgment, but basically testimonies show that there were roughly 2,000 Tutsis killed in Taba between April 7th until the end of June. Killings were so widespread that he should have known about them. He never attempted to prevent the killing of Tutsis, although he had the authority to, and under Article 6.1 of the Tribunal Statute, he was held criminally responsible. I'm going to just skip through these allegations, but just to say that April 19th is a significant date. There was a meeting held with a list of people that were accused of associating with the Rwanda Patriotic Front, and therefore, after that, there was a lot of violence that occurred involving Akayesu, and he conducted house searches, he interrogated witnesses, he ordered the killing of intellectual and influential individuals. So in the actual trial, there were 15 counts. Some involved genocide, complicity in genocide, crimes against humanity, and so forth. I'm going to go down to the fact that remember, this is, again, both of these tribunals are new tribunals, but you have a lot of testimony before the court and you have sexual violence that has occurred, but not enough evidence until witness J and H came forward. Witness J testified regarding the gang rape of her 6-year-old daughter and that young girls were raped at the Bureau Communal. Witness H, a Tutsi woman, testified that she herself was raped and that she witnessed the rape of others. And at that particular point, there was a stir in the international community amongst NGOs like Women's Initiative for Gender Justice and other groups that said, you've got to amend the charges against the accused to include crimes of sexual violence, which occurred. And what was very interesting is that the prosecution stated that evidence previously available was not sufficient to link the accused to acts of sexual violence, and acknowledged that factors to explain this lack of evidence might include the shame that accompanies acts of sexual violence, as well as insensitivity in the investigation of gender violence. Again, on genocide, it doesn't matter. You just need any one of the acts that I spoke about that are enumerated and committed with a specific intent, which we saw. So on the issue of genocide and Article 2, Section 2D, what took place? There were measures intended to prevent birth in the group, sexual mutilation, practice of sterilization, forced birth control, separation of the sexes, and prohibition of marriages. A big thing was the desire to spread disease amongst those who were victimized. Within patriarchal societies, when a woman is deliberately impregnated by a man of another group, that's another way of inflicting genocide. And my time is out, I see. I went by so quick. So what I'm going to do, if I may, in one sentence is as follows. I am going to skip through, I'm just going to say, if I may, in 2 sentences, the role of the media was absent, international and local perpetrated hate. There's hate speech, RTLM, you have pictures of the machete and the weaponization of the woman. You see this, thou shalt not commit, thou shalt not be with a woman who is a Tutsi. Could the media have made a difference? And I'm just going to skip to the very, very end, and I apologize. Recently, we had the conviction of the Dominique Ongwen, who was charged with 61 counts of war crimes, crimes against humanity. What's very important is the fact that now we are in the process of having reparations. And it is important because amicus briefs were filed when he appealed, basically explaining that we had to understand the particularis harm of, forced pregnancy and so forth. Children born of war, we talked about. Last thing, best practices. This is very, very important. Best practices exist on the front, in the front row, from the International Center of Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma. Dr. Yael Danieli talks about massive trauma and the healing role of reparative justice. And this is to address the ongoing effects of genocide. The 2005 UN principles and guidelines for the reparation of victims are informed by a lot of work that Dr. Danieli did and impact litigation. Thanks for letting me do that sum up, and thank you. Thank you. Okay. And the next person will be, I am going to now introduce, bear with me one second, Dr. Sarah Danielson. Dr. Sarah Danielson is professor of history at CUNY, Queensborough, and executive director of the CUNY Academy at the CUNY Graduate Center. She has published a number of articles and book chapters and 4 books on issues of mass violence and intellectual history, most recently, War and Sexual Violence, New Perspectives. And she is currently working on 2 book projects, an edited volume on war and genocide and a monograph on pan-nationalism. She serves as associate editor of the Journal of Genocide Research. Professor Danielson is a member of the International Network of Genocide Scholars, German Studies Association, American Historical Association, Society for French Historical Studies. She is also a co-chair of the Columbia University Faculty Seminar on Law and Politics and a member of the New York Area Seminar in Intellectual and Cultural History. Thank you, Dr. Sarah Danielson. Please come. Thank you.
Hold on a second. I'll use one of her slides, if you don't mind. I don't have any slides. have to go far, though. Sorry about that. There we go. All right. We might be putting the cart before the horse here a little bit. I'm going to talk about the definition of genocide. So we've put the cart before the horse, and now comes the horse, right? I was actually asked to speak on this topic. By the way, thank you, Laura and Lori, so much for inviting me. I came out of the blue, and it was just such a nice invitation. And they asked me specifically to talk about this issue of the concept of genocide. As you know, I only have 15 minutes, so this is going to be quite broad. For those of you who are getting credit, and if you don't get credit, maybe Laura and Lori can provide you with the text that we have submitted. It's not something I've written, but it's a very good general survey of the definitions of genocide, and it provides great context for what I'm saying. I'm not going to repeat it here, but it provides some good context, hopefully. All right, this topic, the definition of genocide, could not be more timely. We see in the current public discourse the charge of genocide being leveled at a number of conflicts, most loudly at the Hamas attacks and the war in Gaza and the war in Ukraine. Less vociferously, there are claims of ongoing genocide in Manipur, India, Nagorno-Karabakh in Armenia, Ethiopia, Sudan, longstanding actions in Syria, Myanmar, and China, and the list can be made much longer. On the one hand, the widespread usage of the term genocide is a testament to how ubiquitous and accepted the concept of genocide has become. On the other hand, the unevenness in application and visibility hints at some of the problems that has been embedded with the term from its very inception. I want to say actually our previous presentation kind of hints also here, Faye's presentation very clearly to that there are some clear gaps in definitions. For many in popular culture, the definition of genocide is not unlike that for pornography. I know it when I see it. But especially considering the potential for intervention that can follow a declaration of genocide resulting from the responsibility to protect. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It was enacted as a norm in 2005. The label can have enormous consequences for victims and perpetrators. And the responsibility to protect is also one of the reasons why the international community is so reluctant to call things out exactly as genocide. So there's a real good question as to what degree it has been for good or for harm, but that's for another day. But the meaning here and applicability of the concept is, as a result, very important. So in broad terms, the concept that originated with Raphael Lemkin and that mixes a Latin and Greek word to form the word genocide has had a complicated and conflicted last 80 years. For Lemkin, the term had clear historical precedence, and although he was initially pointing to the Holocaust and then to the Armenian genocide, he meant for the term to have application throughout the whole of human history. But when his lobbying was finally successful and the Genocide Convention was adopted in 1948, it was a much trimmed down definition that would guide international law. It famously excluded political groups or cultural destruction. The legal definition that we were left with as a result is probably well known by now, and this is, I was included it, and since you had it here so nicely on the slide, I'm going to use it and we can sort of read it together. Acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. That's an interesting wording right there. This includes killing of members, right, causing serious bodily, mental harm, deliberately inflicting on the group condition of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent births, forcibly transferring children. You have it there in front of you. Now, there's a long legal history of how difficult it was to bring this definition to bear on real life cases. Most famously, the We Charge Genocide petition to the UN on behalf of Black Americans in the 1950s, and the Biafra case in the 1960s, and so on and so on. It took until the late 1990s for the International Criminal Court to be established, and that was undoubtedly partly a result of the increase in the 1990s of genocide scholarship as well, that provided gradual pressure. The academic arena had its own problems with grappling with the concept. Despite early works and Lemkin's clear intention to apply the concept beyond World War II, by the 1970s, the concept had become attached exclusively to the Holocaust, and it proved difficult to dislodge. One of the first courses on comparative genocide was offered at City College in 1975, and it was promptly met with charges of anti-Semitism against the professor, himself a Holocaust survivor, and demands for his firing. And he was, by the way, my professor later on, much later on, Henry Hattenbach, who founded the Journal of Genocide Research in the late 1990s. Now, media usage of the term was sparse until the 1990s. There's no secret that the emergence of the term ethnic cleansing among journalists reporting on the Balkan Wars happened because they were uncertain if they could use the term genocide on an event outside the Holocaust. And then in 1994, the stark case of Rwanda, where the convention could have been written to just describe the case, broke the dam, if you will. If anything could be called genocide, right? That certainly could, it was argued. And by the way, you can see this in scholarly conferences as well. 1994 is kind of a breaking point where the idea of genocide, right, being used sort of took over. The following scholarship at the end of the 1990s and the first quarter of our century has released a flood of genocide analysis. Unsatisfied with the legal definition of the Genocide Convention, many provided their own meaning of the term, as those texts would give you some sense of. Others tried to adhere to the convention as much as possible, despite its flaws. The uncertainty has largely resulted in a broad confusion in popular culture about genocide. And it often seems to depend on one's political inclination where the term is applied, where one wishes intervention or not. And let's not kid ourselves, what victims are valued or not. The application of the term spans the spectrum from very restrictive to encompassing any event of mass casualties. There's no question that one can debate the meaning of any concept. Concepts like justice, freedom, equality will continue to be debated. But I think we can agree there is some level of unanimity on what these concepts entail. Concepts like homicide, suicide, fratricide, regicide, concepts that the term genocide is intended to mimic are easily definable and applicable to real life scenarios. But as Dirk Moses has written, concepts like genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes do not possess ontological status, no matter what black letter lawyers may think. They are neither naturally given, nor do they enjoy timeless validity. They are products of history and of particular conjectures of ideas and interests. And this is where the genocide concept must be clarified in context. As a scholar and academic who teaches history of the Holocaust and history of genocide every year, I have to say, I have to confess, I guess, that I find the term often inadequate. What seems clear to me is that Lemkin and the UN Convention were a product of their times, an intellectual history of ideas around what I call demographic restructuring, the most radical of which is mass murder, that emerged in the 19th century, constructed and fortified ideas of national, racial, and ethnic groupings that Lemkin and the convention then assumes and reifies. As Philip Hammond has pointed out, the main problem with such account is that they take for granted that which they purport to explain. The mere facts of ethnic differences is seen in itself, inevitably giving rise to conflict. As Michael Ignatieff notes, the term ethnicity is often used as if it were a fixed biological category. Same for notion, for nation, and race. I would argue that the quagmire of the term's definition and application can be directly traced to its origin. So, which leaves me now with the limited time I have left to just zero in on a particular critique recently, focusing more on the legal side here. an element of the Genocide Convention and what it means for what we declare to be genocide today. And I'm zeroing in here on Dirk Moses's critique in his most recent book, A Problem of Genocide. Since it caused a bit of a stir in the genocide scholarship community, I think it raised some important questions that we have to wrestle with. Moses writes that as a result of the limitations of the Genocide Convention definition, politically, rather than racially defined victims, are effectively assigned a lower status in the hierarchy of criminality. International law and popular culture regard genocide and its archetype, the Holocaust, as the ultimate violation. The result is not only to trivialize war crimes and crimes against humanity, but also to exclude the aerial bombing of civilians, which likewise violates the principle of distinction and is often deadlier. This focus is partly due, he argues, to the enduring role the Holocaust still plays in understanding genocide. He writes, civilian destruction due to a Nazi-like racial hatred rather than interstate aggression captured the judicial and popular imagination. Such as the Holocaust hold on our imagination that the ICC prosecutor of Sudanese leader al-Bashir felt compelled to invoke Holocaust analogies in order to make his case for genocide. Moses writes that as a consequence of genocide's depoliticization by ethnicization and hierarchization, that's hard to say, it is convenient for actors to demarcate genocide from civil war and insurgency, as well as from warfare proper. However problematic Article 2 of the UN, the distinction between ethnic and political violence, Article 2 of the UN Charter forbids intervention in non-international armed conflicts unless they threaten peace, meaning that international interdiction of the mass killing of foreign civilians is illegal in most circumstances. As before the so-called human rights revolution in the 1940s, states can violently repress their own civilians during proclaimed national emergencies. This is resulted from an historical reality that was politically driven. Moses writes, the UN Convention entrenched the virtually untrammeled sovereignty of states in their internal affairs and a relatively free hand in waging aerial warfare abroad. It was inconceivable for the community of nations to protect civilians in general when they met to effect this human rights revolution in the 1940s, because that would entail both prescribing their own conduct during World War II and tying their hands in defending their empires and or waging the predicted war with ideological opponents. In the end, then, we are left with a term and a legal concept that may depend more on one's political interpretation of events than the reality of mass slaughter. It is less about protecting non-combatants than it is protecting states' rights to quote unquote defend themselves. Could the Genocide Convention be reworked? Well, that is a question for legal scholars. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Danielson. Very intriguing thoughts. All right, now I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, our commentator, our first commentator. I think they're both going to be coming up after each other, so I will introduce both. The first is Jacqueline Merekatete, Esquire. She is an internationally recognized genocide survivor and human rights activist. Born in Rwanda, Jacqueline was 9 years old when she lost her family in the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. She has spoken at schools, NGO events, and faith-based communities across the US and in Germany, Israel, Ireland, Bosnia, and Belgium. She has also addressed the UN General Assembly. Jacqueline founded Genocide Survivors Foundation as a vehicle to continue her genocide prevention efforts and raise support for fellow genocide survivors. And you know, there's, if you want, it's genosurvivorsfoundation.org is easy to remember. Jacqueline has a BA in politics from New York University and a JD from Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law. And then Leo S. Ullman was born in 1939 in the Netherlands. That's our second discussant, where he and his family survived in hiding during World War II. His story as a hidden child is chronicled in a couple of self-authored books. He is a graduate of Harvard College and of both Columbia University's Law School and Business School. He practiced law for some 35 years, starting with Sullivan and Cromwell, and including his own firm, Ullman, Miller, and Rubel. He served as Deputy Assistant General Counsel to the U.S. Office of Foreign District Investments and published monographs on its regulations. For more than 10 years, he wrote a monthly column for the Dutch real estate publication Vastgoed on investment in U.S. real estate and was founding editor of a loose-leaf service on taxation of interest, dividends, and royalties in Europe and the U.S. As an adjunct professor for several years at NYU's Graduate School of Business, Mr. Ullman taught a course on legal aspects of international business. While practicing law, Mr. Ullman also started a real estate ownership and management company, which he took to the New York Stock Exchange in 2003. In 2005, he was named Entrepreneur of the Year by Ernst & Young. Thank you both, and we will hear from Jacqueline Ridicatetti, please. And I think
good evening, everyone. I want to begin by saying how honored I am to be here. And I also want to thank Lori and Laura and my dear friend Faye for including me in today's program as just to say a few words about the presentations. And I'm particularly honored because as Lori said, to be here on this very moment, because this is a year when we are marking or observing the 30th anniversary of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, a genocide in which I lost my entire family, as you heard, my entire immediate family and most of my extended family. I also feel privileged to be here because, as I said to a few of you who I've had the opportunity to speak to individually earlier, I feel that there's really no better time for a conversation, for a conference like this, because I feel that over the last year or so, a lot of us have been craving spaces in which we can actually have constructive conversations about history, about the different crises that we are witnessing right now. This is an opportunity that I found to be lacking because we are living in a world where it seems to me that people are more interested in attacking each other, in labeling each other as an enemy that need to be eliminated, than in listening and learning, particularly from actual historians and scholars and academics who have so much that they contribute to this conversation. It seems to me that people are more interested in reacting to 30 seconds, 20-second TikTok, YouTube, social media clips. And I say all that to, again, say how important it is to have a space like this, to have a conference like this. And I do hope that in the coming month, we can create these opportunities because I really do feel that this is what we need to figure out how we get to from the place where we are now, from a period of so much pain, of so much trauma, of so much human suffering, of alarming levels of hate and extremism and disinformation. The only way we can move forward, one of the best ways that I feel we can move forward, is having spaces like this. And where we can all work together towards hopefully creating an environment, a world where every human being can exist with peace and security. So I know Faye gave a lot about my background, but I just want to say that genocide is, or genocide prevention specifically, is a work that I'm deeply, deeply passionate about as a result of my own experience, as I said, as a child during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. When that genocide happened, began in April of 1994. I was a young child of 9 with parents with 6 siblings, with aunts, with uncles, with goals and dreams like any other 9-year-old child. But when the genocide began, I, like other Tutsi children and Tutsis generally in Rwanda, found ourselves in an environment where we were forced to flee from our homes and to go hiding from one place to the next in search of a place to survive and to hide. And this was something very, very difficult because, as Faye said in her presentation, the goal in 1994, as it is a goal with other genocides, cases of genocide, was extermination. We found ourselves in a place where the then extremist Hutu government was constantly inciting the Hutu civilian population to kill Tutsis. Tutsis were labeled as an enemy that needed to be eliminated. And during those 100 days of killing, of genocide, myself, Console, my fellow survivor who's here today, who has spoken many times to students here at Wagner College, Console, myself, and other Tutsi children, again, found ourselves living in an environment where every day when we woke up, we did not know whether we were going to leave to see the next day. My story of survival is a long one. If you want to learn more about my story, my testimony, there are many videos of me speaking and sharing on YouTube. So if you put my name in YouTube, you can find many videos. But at the end of the genocide, I will come to learn, as I said, that while I was one of those few people who survived, that my parents, my siblings were among the over 1 million people who were murdered in just 100 days. The killings in Rwanda were very efficient, and they were efficient because they were prepared. One of the things I always say when I speak about genocide is to emphasize that genocide is not a crime that happens overnight. It's a crime that is planned. In the case of Rwanda, the genocide against Tutsis arose from years of state-sanctioned discrimination in which Tutsis were discriminated against in every aspect of the Rwandan society. We had an ethnic-based ID cards that we all held, and this was used to discriminate against Tutsis in schools, in the workforce, certainly in the government, in every aspect of the Rwandan society. The genocide also arose from many years of anti-Tutsi propaganda. Tutsis were constantly often labeled as not as Rwandans, not as citizens who deserve the same rights as their Hutu neighbors, but as invaders. There was this anti-Tutsi narrative which portrayed Tutsis as invaders who had come from Ethiopia and oppressed Hutus. And the Hutu extremist government always told educated the Hutu youth in this propaganda. The Tutsis were invaders, that they were an enemy, as I said, that needed to be exterminated. And this is something that when you study genocide, across the board, it's something that you often find across the board, that our population is portrayed. We're seeing this happening right now in the Middle East. They are portrayed as invaders and foreigners in their own homeland. This was the case in Rwanda, particularly even during the genocide. The Hutu extremists who say that they are going to send the Tutsis back to Ethiopia through the Nyabarongo River. This is a river where my immediate family was actually taken and murdered. So after the genocide, I learned that one day during the genocide, my Hutu neighbors, people whose children I had grown up playing with, going to school with, going to churches with, people who used to come to my house in the middle of the night to borrow salt when they ran out of salt, people who my family had attended weddings with, child naming ceremonies with. I learned that these very same neighbors had taken my parents, my 6 siblings, from the oldest to the youngest. My youngest brother was only a couple weeks old at the time. My grandmother, my uncle, all the Tutsis in the village, and they had taken them to the river called the Nyabarongo, and they had proceeded to murder them and to throw their bodies in that same river. Again, saying that they were going to send all those Tutsis, all Tutsis, back to Ethiopia. This is a kind of anti-Tutsi propaganda that was being repeated during the genocide. So after surviving the genocide and having the opportunity to come to this country, I had an uncle who found out that I had survived, adopted me and raised me. So I came here at the age of 10. Was placed in school where I began, learning English and so forth. But my work in genocide prevention education didn't begin until I was a sophomore in high school, when I had the opportunity to listen to a Holocaust survivor, the late David Gertzman. My English class, my sophomore class, read the book Night by Elie Wiesel. And after I read the book, our English teacher at that time had the wisdom of inviting Holocaust survivor to share his testimony. And it was David who inspired me to start speaking about Rwanda. This was in 2001. So for the past almost more than 20 years now, I have dedicated myself to this work. I do it because I feel like other survivors, we feel that we must educate people about what happened in Rwanda in 1994, but more generally, we must educate people about the crime of genocide because we believe that genocide is the worst crime that human beings can commit. This is something that I understood even when the genocide in Rwanda was happening. Even at the age of 9, I understood that there was no worse crime, because to be discriminated against, persecuted, murdered, simply because of who you are, simply because of something that you cannot help but be, there's no worse crime. So for me, the work that I do today with the Genocide Survivors Foundation really stems from that belief that in this day and age, the crime of genocide is not something that should be happening. But I am also very much troubled by the fact that the crime of genocide, or the label of genocide, we are seeing more and more, as Sarah was just saying, that the term is often being abused and misused, and it's problematic for me as a genocide prevention activist, because I feel like we are living at a time where the term is being so much, so abused and so misused that we may get to the point where it no longer have the meaning that it was intended to have. Because when the term was coined by Raphael Lemkin, as it was stated before, this was to be, as it's been said, the crime of crimes, a unique crime that was very much distinct from other levels of violence. There's a lot of injustices, there's a lot of civilian suffering that goes on in the world, but this was intended to be a unique crime. And the fact that we're living at a time where the term genocide is being labeled in places where it should not be used. And it's also, in the case of Rwanda in 1994, at a time when it was supposed to be used, it was not used, because by the time the UN Security Council actually used the term genocide to refer to what was happening in Rwanda, it was too late for most of the Tutsis. The majority of Tutsis were murdered in April. So by the time they actually used that term, it was too late. And they had intentionally, the UN Security Council had intentionally refused to use that term because, like Sarah said, they knew of the obligations that using the term brought, that they had to intervene. So we have a situation like that where genocide was supposed to be the appropriate term for what's happening. And now we have situations that we have now where it is used as a political tool, where it is used as a way to defame a government and as a people, where it is used as a way to gain attention. And one of the things that I always say is that I think it's important for people to recognize that not everything has to be genocide to demand our attention or to demand our intervention. I feel that every human life or human lives, innocent human lives are tragically, that are brutally cut short is a tragedy that should be mourned for by all of us. But it doesn't. We don't have to use the term genocide for as an attention seeking or as a political or economic tool. So those are some of the few words I wanted to just say about, about the term and the concerns that as a genocide prevention activist that I have when it comes to genocide prevention. I do fear that particularly with the alarming levels of disinformation that we are witnessing, particularly in the social media, that unless legal scholars and academics and genocide prevention activists really start coming up and having these conversations, that the use and misuse of the word may, in the long run, undermine its intended purposes and its effectiveness. In response to Dr. Wolf's presentation, I just wanted to really say that I really appreciate the presentation on resistance. As I said earlier, I feel like it's an aspect that is hardly ever discussed, but that is very, very important to discuss because this is something you find in addition to the Holocaust in other genocides. In the case of Rwanda, there were many attempts by Tutsis, men, women, and children to resist. There were armed resistance. There were verbal resistance in terms of oral resistance and written resistance. But I always say that as much as they tried, the likelihood of success, unfortunately, was 0 to none, because when you are in an environment where your own government, your own neighbors, your own church leaders, churches became sites of mass murder during the genocide, where your own neighbors, your own teachers have turned against you, you do the best you can to resist. But the odds were against the resistance efforts. But it is important for us to talk about it, particularly also, again, given the current realities. I think it's very important that all decent human beings, people of good conscience, stand up during the time that we're living in, and stand up and resist the levels of hate and disinformation and extremism that we are witnessing. I think that learning about the examples of the individual Jewish men and women, the actions that they took to resist during the Holocaust should inform us and hopefully encourage us and motivate us to use our own agencies now, our own opportunities, our own networks to stand up and to say that hate and extremism and disinformation has no place at this time and has no place really at any time. Hate and extremism, as I always say, only serves to compound existing pain and suffering and trauma, and hate and extremism only compounds existing fears. So people can agree and disagree on different things, but I think we should all be clear in that hate and extremism has no place. There's so much that I can say about, I see I have 4 minutes, about the other presentations, the presentation on Bosnia and phase presentation. In regards to Bosnia, all I can say is that I very much agree with you, particularly on the importance of reparation and reparative justice for survivors. As a genocide prevention activist, this is one of the things that I've been fighting for in regards to the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. It is a right. It is a right that victims and survivors are entitled to, and it is something that is needed urgently in the case of Rwanda and Bosnia, as you said, because with Rwanda, although it's been 30 years, there's still a lot of survivors still dealing with many challenges, physical challenges, psychological challenges, economic challenges, lack of access to education opportunities, and reparation is one of the ways, the best ways that we can address this. Nonprofits organizations like mine, like Genocide Survivors Foundation, we do our best to provide services, to provide support to survivors, but often we feel like we're just a drop in the ocean of need. And when I speak about genocide prevention, I always say that one of the best way we can honor victims of genocide is to make sure that the surviving widows and orphans get the support and services that they need to live the rest of their lives with dignity and with the support and security that they need. And reparation is the best way to address this. And with the sexual violence and gender-based violence during genocide and other mass atrocity crimes, I mean, I know Faye talked about Rwanda as well, but Console, my dear friend Console, fellow survivor, she has written a book. It's called Tested to the Limit. where she gives her testimony of what she went through during the genocide, and the testimony of many women, Tutsi women and girls, who were subjected to rape and other forms of sexual violence during the genocide. And I would like to, to quote one researcher in Rwanda. When she was talking about the sexual violence that took place during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, she emphasized, as Faye said, that this was systematic and it was not a random act. The Hutu extremists used radio, which was the main source of communication between the government and the civilian population at that time, to encourage Hutus to rape Tutsi women and girls. And at the end of the genocide, it's estimated that more than 250,000 women and girls were raped. This number is, a lot of people think, is an underestimate because, as others have said, because of the stigma that is often attached to victims of sexual violence, very few of them were not enough are able to come forward. But Robin Spencer states that in reference to the sexual violence against women during the genocide in Rwanda, she said, and I quote, "Sexual violence was not just a weapon. It was genocide in and itself, a step in the process of destruction of Tutsi group, destruction of the spirit, of the will to live, and of life of itself." So like other cases of genocide, as I said, it was part of the genocide perpetration. And this is why, as genocide prevention activists, as legal scholars, were very much encouraged when the Akayesu case, the ICTR came and formally defined rape under international criminal law and recognized rape as a means of perpetrating genocide. We hope that moving forward, this important precedent can provide a legal pathway for victims of sexual violence, and that hopefully can make progress in terms of being able to deliver justice and to fight the level of denial that we're witnessing, especially when it comes to sexual violence. So I know my time is up. I'm going to end here, but I want to end by again thanking you, Lori and Laura, for having this space. And it is my hope that over coming days, we can continue to have these conversations, because I feel like this is the best way that we can respond to the particularly dark time and troubling time that we are living in, is having conversations like these. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for being here. Professors Laura and Laurie are just tremendous. And I think Wagner College / University is outstanding. And I'm just delighted to be here. I also want to pay my respects to the speakers who focused on a lot of stuff that I don't have very much comment on. My story, very briefly, is I was born in 1939. My mother and her family were in the diamond business in Holland before the war in 1940. There were approximately 9 million people. Of those 9 million, 145,000 were Jewish. Of those 145,000, 85,000 lived in Amsterdam. Of those 85,000, 25,000 were in the diamond business. My mother's family was in the diamond business. They lived very, very well. They were fully integrated into Dutch society. They were not discriminated against in any manner. My mother married my father in 1936. My father had come from Germany in 1932, and he somehow met my mother, and surely in 1939 they had this really rambunctious, cute little boy. The problem was that in Holland, in as late as September 1939, Hitler had promised that he would not attack the Netherlands because Holland had been neutral during World War I. And as a result of that, he promised that he would not attack them. Notwithstanding that, and all the Dutch relied on that, the Dutch military couldn't stand up against anybody. These days, the Dutch military is unionized. They don't have to march in step. They don't have to salute. Having been in the Marine Corps, this is a concept I can't understand, but never mind. At any rate, my parents were just doing fine, and all of a sudden, on May 10th of 1940, notwithstanding his promise in 1939, Hitler attacked the city of Rotterdam, bombed it to smithereens. Tens of thousands of people lost their homes. Many tens lost their lives. Within 2 days, Holland was taken over by the Germans. A few of my family were able to get out. They went to fishing ports and they could buy their way onto a fishing boat that would take them to England and ultimately, hopefully, to the US or Canada. My parents and I and one of my grandmothers went to one of the fishing ports. We could not get on a boat. It was utter chaos. I had an earache. My grandmother had a toothache, or vice versa. We decided to go back to our apartment in Amsterdam, and we'd escape another day. Well, of course, that other day didn't come. The Germans closed the borders, and we were locked in Amsterdam. At first, for a couple of weeks, everything was okay. But once the Germans took over, hundreds, and literally hundreds of Dutch Jews committed suicide because they feared what was coming. Holland was governed starting in as early as 2 months after they took over Rotterdam. Holland was governed by a vicious anti-Semite named Seyss-Inquart. Seyss-Inquart was the man who governed Austria and invited Hitler to come and take over Austria. He was then appointed governor of Holland, and he started issuing decrees from the very first moment. Those decrees slowly but surely dehumanized the Jews. Again, there were only 34,000 Jews in Holland. Shortly after Hitler took over, a lot of them were able to escape. A lot of them came to other countries and via Portugal or otherwise came to South America. At any rate, of the 145,000 Jews before the war, only 14,000 survived the war. 110,000 of the Jews lost their lives during the war. It's the highest percentage of any country other than Lithuania and Poland. It's a legacy that hardly the Dutch are even aware of. In recent polls, half of Holland was not aware of the Holocaust and its results. Hard to believe, but it's true. At any rate, the decrees started coming. We first had to provide a list of everything that we owned of any value, including up to gold teeth. We had to wear at age 6 or up the Jewish star. We had to have IDs with the J on it. We had to adopt certain Jewish names. But we were still alive. Then further decrees. We could not use public transportation. We could not have cars or bicycles or mopeds or any kind of transportation. We had curfews. We could not be anywhere after 8 o'clock at night. We could only shop in certain stores for Jews. We could not have public education. We could not use public restaurants, but we were still alive. And then in 1943, the transports really started toward the German work camps. My father received a notice the same day that Margot Frank, Anne Frank's sister, received a notice that they had to report for travel to a work camp in Germany. My parents were young, they were healthy, they thought they could survive a work camp. They went to the train station, my father did, and he saw that not just healthy young people were being transported, but in fact, all sorts of invalids, children, the elderly, people that wouldn't be going to work camps. And my father and mother at that point decided that they had to go into hiding. As I mentioned, they had this precocious, cute little kid, and they had to figure out what to do with me. Through my mother's sorority, and a sorority in Holland is a lifetime commitment. It's not just 4 years of college, it's a lifetime. Through her sorority, she came in touch with a sorority sister who was active in the resistance. And this sorority sister was close to a minister, a Dutch Reformed minister in the city of Haarlem, who arranged for Jewish kids to be placed in hiding. And through that contact, I came in contact ultimately with a policeman and his wife who took me in and treated me as their child. They didn't know my name. They didn't know where I came from. All they knew is that I was a Jewish kid. My parents, in the meantime, were not allowed to know where I would be placed. They found a hiding place in an attic on the main street of Amsterdam. They were in that attic for 2.5 years, 24 hours a day with each other. And I mentioned this to somebody this morning. I can't be in a canoe with my wife for more than an hour. Think of 24 hours a day for 2.5 years, the amount of trust that you have to have in one another to suffer through that. And also to know that huge bounties were paid for anybody who betrayed a hidden Jew. And the Germans and the Nazis had raids periodically where they blocked off a block in a city. All Jews, incidentally, had to come to Amsterdam. They blocked off a block and they would go house to house and try to find Jewish hidden people. And these bounties became very substantial, and there were gangs, there were roving gangs looking for Jews to get paid. So it was very, very dangerous. And there can be all the plays on Anne Frank and so forth that you can imagine. You cannot replicate the utter and complete terror that every noise, every step, every motorized vehicle could be the end of your life. But they lived through that. And the war ultimately ended on May 5th, 1945. Amsterdam was liberated at that time by the Canadian Maple Leaf Brigade. And at that time, my war parents, as I called them, knew that my real parents, if they had survived, that they would come and get me. And my real parents, again, through the sorority connection, came to learn where I was in hiding and that I was alive. And they came to pick me up. They looked terrible. And these two people suddenly claimed that they were my parents. I didn't remember them. It had been 2.5 years that I'd been there. I was 3 years old when I went into hiding. I was 6.5 when this event came. And suddenly these people claimed that they were my real parents. That was difficult, but we got through it. One of the meaningful things that happened is that my war parents gave to me their dog, Ruffy. That was a meaningful tie. And also my war father came to the hospital. I had an eye operation right after the war. He came to the hospital every day and he walked me to school every day. So they stayed in my lives literally until a couple of weeks ago. I've been in touch with my war families. They saved my life. So I've been close to them for all these years. I've gone back to Holland several times. I used to go back as much as 10 times a year because while I practiced law, my clients were Dutch. I went back to Holland after law school for 1.5 years. And I created a law business mostly with Dutch clients because I read, speak, and write Dutch. At any rate, that link has been extremely important. I'd like to mention 2 things on the quasi-legal side. One is I attended, and I've been very much involved on the U.S. Foundation for the Netherlands National Holocaust Museum. That museum just opened formally in March of this year, and the reception was held in the Portuguese synagogue, a very old, beautiful, very large building. And at that ceremony, there was the King of the Netherlands, the President of Israel, the President of Germany, and the President of Austria. The security was such that I've never imagined within this very large building, which is old and has no heat or electricity, there were drones. There were drones flying around inside the building. I've never heard of that happening. There was a lot of security, as you can imagine. But what was very significant is that the Dutch king acknowledged that his mother, Queen Wilhelmina, or that his grandmother, Queen Wilhelmina, was not good to the Jews during the war. Sadly enough, she did not support the Jews very much. Holland, incidentally, is the only country in Europe or anywhere else where there was a national strike in support of the Jews. In 1941, as early as 1941, the Dutch dock workers union, a socialist/communist union, struck in favor of the Jews. The result of that was it angered Seyss-Inquart. They took 450 young men. All but one of those perished. At any rate, the king acknowledged that his grandmother didn't do much for the Jews. The presidents of Austria and Germany apologized to the Dutch people for what they had perpetrated during the war. That's pretty unusual. And it was very meaningful at the time. The other thing that I want to mention is the unique structure that the Germans created in Holland, and I believe elsewhere, including Belgium, where they created a Jewish council. The Jewish council consisted of the most important lawyers, primarily, who in Holland were also notaries. These notaries were not the type where you give them a quarter and they sign a piece of paper. The notaries were appointed by the Queen, and there were only a handful appointed by the Queen, or the King in this case. And those notary / lawyers were the leaders of the Jewish Council. And the role of the Jewish Council was to satisfy the Nazis who controlled Amsterdam with a list of people who were to be sent to the concentration camps. This is the leading Jews appointing the people who were to be sent to the concentration camp. That's a structure, a legal fiction, a legal structure that is so brutal and nasty, because what happened ultimately, as you may imagine, is that the Jews on the Jewish Council selected people other than our crowd. They selected people who were at the bottom of their lists rather than their own friends. And after the war, the leaders of the Jewish Council were kicked out of the Jewish community, and rightfully so. I think I'd like to end my talk at this point. I covered two things that are quasi-legal, and the rest of it is a bit of my story. But it's a different story, and it's a story that also brings into play, and you have to think about this. The Holocaust was perpetrated by the Germans, not at the outset with the intent to kill the Jews. At the outset, the intent was to get rid of the Jews, but England wouldn't take us, the US wouldn't take us. Look at what happened with the St. Louis. And in a way, we left him with the choice of killing us or figuring out some other way to get rid of us. And that part of it is really difficult to swallow. And it involves President Roosevelt in big terms. At any rate, so the Holocaust was reactive in many sense. Also, unlike some of the stories you heard today, it was not one people against the others. It was a government-controlled killing operation. There is rampant anti-Semitism in this country at the moment, and a lot of it, of course, raised after October 7. But a lot of it is private. It's not the government that's creating this, and that's a very meaningful difference that we all should keep in mind. I'll end it with that, and I thank you all very, very much for listening.
Well, these were all remarkable talks, and we thank you so much for all of the information you shared, and also to so many of you for sharing your personal stories as well. We would like the final words to go to Charles DiStefano, who's the president of the Staten Island Trial Lawyers Association, and the Honorable Karen Wolf, if they can just close the evening for us with some of their thoughts, and then we will invite everyone to the cocktail hour. So I am welcoming Charles. Thank you.
and my own personal experience with my uncle. That's my dad. Sent off to the war, actually July 16th. This 10 days post D-Day, so it's kind of interesting. And it was Easter Sunday, 1971, and my uncle, who was decorated for the what hats on Fourth Army Division. He asked my dad, and I was 10 years old, to my work, and my dad said, I think he's right. I'm glad he did that because I have been personally affected since then. My uncle was part of a group of soldiers that liberated a death camp, sub camp, Buchenwald, which was called Wagner. And they, soldiers, they were all young men, not expecting it, although they suspected it. So when they arrived in Ohrdruf, they came across what is shown here, piles of forced laborers, many of them shot, killed on the spot. Way. So with that said, Patton and Eisenhower filling happens there. Eisenhower told all his troops and take out your brownie cameras, small port cameras, and I want you to photograph this because no one will happen. So these are actual photographs taken by my uncle. The inscriptions on the back, you're all welcome to look at it. And actually, his unit, they took copious notes about it. And on April 9, 1945, states the concentration camp at Ohrdruf, a few miles from here, and it's surely conclusive proof that, quote, type notes filed after the war. So, what can we do? I am not a historian. What can we do? Because one of the most revered people and I said, Rabbi, this happened. I don't right in this very country, which I'm stunned by, especially by. So what I've done since then is, and again, you're welcome to take a look, is I decided that we are most impacted by the monster. Really motivated to see and hear speakers, the stories, witnesses. I also find that demonstrative at this meeting things are very impactful. And this in particular is a bloodline certificate. And the Nazis required every person to describe who their great-grandparents were, their parents were, and then who they were. And if they were proved, they got the stamp of the Nazis. On the back, it describes the levels. Okay. Consanguinity. What level of blood do you have? And of course, they describe the highest level, arrogant, and a lot of which do that. So these are real objects. These are things that, and I show them to kids because they are living in a world in which their phones contain everything, and they hear a lot of fuzz. So what I do tell them is, this is real. And this is not, this is a mass produce, not in the hundreds. Probably the ceramic factory, Schindler's factory. But one thing is sure, probably hundreds of thousands of these were on the walls of restaurants. Jews will not be served here. So we continue to live our lives and watch it. Wanda watches the attack. But we people in this room, and I say so much, all put it to our future. Education, correcting mistakes. So I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I implore you all, just see that.
Good evening, and thank you, Charles, for that. I've come to know Charles through the Holocaust Museum, and he is a righteous person. Thank you all for attending this evening, and thank you to all of the remarkable presenters tonight. This program was created by Drs. Lori Weintraub and Laura Morowitz, who worked tirelessly to make this conference happen. And what an incredible job. Thank you to our CLE sponsor this evening, the Richmond County Bar Association, with special thanks to Timothy O'Donovan, immediate past president. We appreciate all of our sponsors and supporters. I'm sure each of us will take away from this conference different things that resonated with each of us. Dr. Alma Begacevic explained the genocide in Bosnia-Herzegovina, a part of history for me I knew about, but the history that I learned was sanitized, and I did not know until tonight the extent of the horrific acts of the violence, murder, rape, and other unfathomable acts. And Alma spoke of the role that monetary reparations should play as an individual debt owed to the victims of war for the non-pecuniary damages caused by that genocide, the murder, injury, grave emotional and psychological harms inflicted on the individuals and their close family members. Thank you, Dr. Sarah Danielson, for speaking about the fundamental issue of what is genocide, how is it defined, explaining how international scholars and politicians have long debated in what context it should be used, and how currently genocide has become freely used and even misused. Sarah has also caused us to question the limitations of the word genocide itself. Faye Paris turned the lens of genocide upon the crimes of sexual and gender-based violence, rape, mutilation, sexual terrorism, used to humiliate and as a weapon of war, to make the case, to win the case, that the enduring physical and psychological harms this violence causes, which are intergenerational, are acts of genocide, deliberate acts inflicted on a group calculated to bring about their destruction in whole or part. Commentators Jacqueline Murder-Kateti and Leo Ullman shared their impactful and deeply personal stories and perspectives as survivors of genocide in Rwanda and in the Holocaust. Jacqueline explained that the Tutsi genocide, 1 million murdered in 100 days, was organized and years in the making, years of state-sanctioned discrimination and anti-Tutsi propaganda. And Leo Ullman also explained how the Holocaust was years in the making. Dr. Wolf Gruner has reconceptualized what resistance meant during the Holocaust to dispel the notion of Jewish passivity. That resistance meant not only armed rebellions, but the courageous acts of individuals to defy and disobey inhumane Nazi laws, to protest against persecution, and to be willing to face the inevitable consequences of their resistance. For me, I have so many takeaways. Some of the important takeaways from the evening: the importance of education as to the crime of genocide, the importance of open dialogue, and that hate and extremism has no place and only begets more hate. Leo Ullman explicitly explained what happens when the world turned its back on the Jews across Europe. We must remain aware. We must stand up and be bold and brave. And we must speak out as resistors in ways both large and small to dismantle injustice and inhumanity when we see it in our communities, our nations, and across the world. Well, we will be continuing our evening with a cocktail hour. And this will be a wonderful time to continue the discourse about this absolutely extraordinary event, or a time to simply unwind, relax, and enjoy the company of wonderful people. Thank you so much. Enjoy the evening.